recognition of a sense of duty. Okay, we have this intuitive recognition. We must explain that in some way. To wit, ultimately, a moral lawgiver. You see. So my guess is that Kant would applaud Anscombe for that point, while rejecting her natural law theory with its metaphysical basis. You see. But the connection between moral law and moral lawgiver Kant recognizes just as plainly as Anscombe. Yeah. Kant would say you have to postulate for lawgiver, and I suspect that Anscombe, at least in the 1950s, as a Thomist, would have said we can use Thomas's 5 arguments for the moral lawgiver. Yeah, he would say we have a sense of moral obligation, that intuition. Well, yeah, we have an intuitive recognition of the common base of morality, that we should always act out of a sense of duty. Yeah, in that sense it's intuitive. The contradiction comes in trying to act rationally and do something that is wrong. That's where the contradiction shows up, in the particular moral judgment. Right. But I think the difference between them that you may be getting at is this. I use the term intuitive for Kant. Yeah, not in the sense of Moore or Ross, it's not intuitive, but in the sense of a common core of morality. But because of the coming of the positivist verifiability criterion, Anscombe would want to avoid that sort of approach. Because the positivist would ask Kant, what is the status? What is the meaning of this sense of duty? Is this an empirically accessible sense of duty? And the positivist would say, no, it's not. So Kant's ethic would be ruled out by Ayer's motivist theory. You follow? Now, in sidestepping that, Anscombe is trying to get back to a meaning for the conception of duty or moral law, okay? Therefore making it depend on a moral lawgiver. Go. So the recognition of moral law is not real for the moral lawgiver? It's not intuitive, it's more kind of... Yes. So that if a person is a thoroughgoing naturalist and has no moral lawgiver, they're not likely to find any meaning in moral law. Yeah. No factual meaning at all. Now, you see, ask yourself, you can see this quite plainly, ask yourself what sort of meaning, in terms of Ayer's verifiability theory, what sort of meaning attaches to a statement like, we are all of us morally bound by universal law. You see? Well, to be morally bound, what does that mean? To have subjective feelings of having to do this, subjective feelings of guilt, all right, Ayer would say that's something for the psychologist to describe, has nothing to do with moral obligation. You see? So if you revert simply to psychological descriptions, that doesn't help at all. Okay? Remember Ayer's 4 kinds of moral language? Remember? There are psychological descriptions. There are psychological and other subjective descriptions. There are exhortations, okay, which are simply emoting. There are outright emotive utterances. There are purported moral judgments. There are meta-ethical statements, I should say, as well. All right, let's move on to the next. The outcome of that debate over moral language and its meaning reintroduced normative ethics. And we've had the last 20 years of thoroughly vigorous activity in normative ethics. I've listed 5 of the most influential writers, names that you should get familiar with, and you already are if you've been taking ethical theory. John Rawls, Harvard, his book on the theory of justice, introducing a contractarian approach. You recall John Locke's notion of a state of nature, which led, because of common needs and rights, led to a civil society that depended on some sort of social contract. What Rawls is doing is not just talking about a contractarian basis for government, but a contractarian basis for all morality. So he needs to have his equivalent of Rawls' state of nature. And what he describes is what would go on behind what he calls a veil of ignorance. A veil of ignorance. That is to say, if, let's get some space here. That is to say, if a group of people were to adopt a stance that they know nothing about future outcomes which might affect them for better or for worse, okay, a veil of ignorance, what sort of principles would you then set up for the ordering of our lives behind that veil of ignorance? And he suggests that what would emerge, what he proposes, basis on 2 principles, one, that the benefits and costs of the society should be equitably distributed, and second, that this should be, when there is inequity, with advantage to the least advantaged people, with benefit favouring the least advantaged. Well, and on that he tried to propose the way in which a political economy could be ordered in that sort of fashion. It's not quite a utilitarian approach, although when he talks of equalizing benefits and costs, there's obviously a consequentialist note. But it's not a utilitarian approach. He's not simply saying outright, maximize the benefit for the maximum number of people. No. There's a Kantian note in it, the emphasis on equality, ignoring other considerations. There's a Kantian note in it, but it's not a Kantian ethic, acting out of a basic sense of duty. It's a contractarian arrangement. So that morality does not rest on some divine command. It does not rest on some a priori moral principle. It does not rest on empirical assessment of consequences. Okay? Now, in that way, you eliminate divine command, you eliminate natural law, you eliminate Kantian ethics, you eliminate utilitarian ethics. It rests rather on social agreement. It rests rather on social agreement. And his approach has had an immense amount of discussion, not only among ethicists, but in political science, in economics, so forth. In general, his leanings are towards a more liberal than conservative political economic philosophy on the basis of these principles. Also at Harvard, Robert Nozick, Anarchy, the State and Utopia, is about as conservative in economic and political thought as one could be. Nozick's point is that there is just one basic principle, that every individual has the right to acquire whatever he can, as long as he doesn't take it illegally from somebody else. Acquisition rights. It's a form of ethical egoism. The one basic moral principle is respect for acquisition rights. Oh, he does advocate a safety net for the least advantaged. But essentially, it's a thoroughgoing individualism. It seems to me that he's the philosophical expression of the kind of Reaganomics that talked of individual initiative and essentially of acquisition rights with minimums of legal regulation and safety net. Curiously, there was two people in the same department at the same time at Harvard. A few years ago, there was one of our graduates in law school there at Harvard, and they were having a discussion about these 2 points of view in one law class, when a voice from the back of the room, which turned out to be Rawls, interrupted and corrected somebody, and another voice turned out to be Nozick, from the other side of the room, interrupted likewise, and so they had the two of them in that law class debating this issue. Lots of debates, I suspect. Alan Gaworth, University of Chicago, just retired a couple of years ago, Reason and Morality, essentially a Kantian. And in many ways, he's representative of a rebirth of Kantian approaches to ethics, frequently called respect for persons. Respect for persons is the basic principle. You remember that Kant's second formulation of the categorical imperative was that we should always treat people as ends, not just as means. Respect for persons. Well, Alan Gaworth tries to spell that out in terms of the fact that I and each one of us want to have the maximum freedom possible to pursue our own life project. Now, the fact that I want that freedom, if I'm going to be logically consistent rather than logically self-contradictory, means that I should respect other people's freedom for the same end. So we have what he calls a principle of generic consistency. A principle of generic consistency, which is really Kant's universalizability principle. You don't want to assert your own ends, your own goals, your own rights, in violation of the same rights in others. That would be violating the principle of generic consistency. And so he has tried to rebuild a Kantian ethic thus. Alan Donegan, who was also at Chicago for many years and then moved to Caltech, died just a year and a half, 2 years ago. Alan Donegan's book, The Theory of Morality, also Kantian. What he tried to do is to pick up on the principle of respect for persons and see what could be inferred from that in terms of the implementation of a more specifically developed kind of ethic. What he did was to argue that the essential principles of Judeo-Christian ethic are true. You'll be interested that he told me this once when he was out here, that while it took him many years to work this through and argue it, after the book had gone to the printer, he came to the conclusion that if the Judeo-Christian ethic was true, that the underlying theology probably was too, and he ought to become a Christian. And being an ethical person, he did. And quite a remarkable individual at the same time. Alan Donegan, a very worthwhile book. Alistair MacIntyre, name you've heard in a number of connections, I'm sure. 3 works in this field that are very influential and represent a turn from rule-governed approaches to moral decisions and actions, turning from that, a rule-governed approach to moral decisions, an ethic of decision-making, turning from that rather to what we call virtue ethics, an emphasis on moral character, the moral qualities of the person, rather than the moral quality of individual actions. Now, in As to Virtue, he really traced the whole history of ethics from pre-Socratic times, in fact from Homeric times, before the pre-Socratics, from Homeric times way up into post-Kantian times, making the point that the early Greeks, and on into Plato and Aristotle and the Stoics, and on into the medievals, were all interested primarily in the cultivation of virtue, concern for the growth, the development of the soul. You find in Plato, you find in Augustine, and so forth, the development of character. And it's not until the 18th century, really, that you find in the Enlightenment the development of a rule-based ethic of decision and actions taking precedence. Now, you have to be careful you don't overgeneralize, because certainly in people like Augustine and Thomas Aquinas, with their natural law approaches to ethics, there is concern about moral rules, namely natural moral law, as well as biblical law, to guide moral decisions and produce right actions. That's there. But the larger concern is that of the virtues. In fact, it's interesting to notice, and it may seem initially paradoxical to hear it, that when Thomas Aquinas is talking about the rules for just war theory, he's doing so under the large rubric of the virtue of love. The virtue of love. Because love requires that justice be tempered with love. And so just war has to be understood in that sort of way. Now, what MacIntyre does, however, is not only trace then the development of these two traditions in ethics, look at what came after virtue in a rule-governed ethic. Look at the development of utilitarianism and its complete indifference to matters of virtue. It's simply interested in maximum utility of actions and policies. You see. It's after non-moral ends rather than the moral end of character development. He does that. But he also makes the point that these rest on different traditions, different philosophical traditions that are incommensurable. Now, to talk of incommensurability is to say that you cannot evaluate one by the norms of the other. You cannot translate one into terms of the other. They're not reducible, the one to the other. And he pursues this further in the second of these volumes, Whose Justice, Which Rationality? Where the question whose justice makes plain the incommensurability of the traditions as far as the meaning and demands of justice are concerned. But which rationality lays emphasis on the incommensurability of the reasons that are given for the moral points of view that are offered. There are different standards of rational judgment that are involved. And that theme comes out once again in his third volume that appeared just a couple of years ago, Three Rival Versions of Moral Inquiry. Three Rival Versions of Moral Inquiry. Now, if you have time to read only one of these three, read the third. It's much more succinct than the others. Each of the others could have been written, I think, and the argument pressed effectively in half the length. But MacIntyre's the sort of big Scotch-Irish person who is very effusive with his language and with his interests, so that what he writes is fascinating with all sorts of historical lore, especially where it's anything about the Scottish. I mean, it's, you get an education about Scottish history and the whole thing, but others as well. He just has fascinating interests in social history, not just intellectual history, but social history, that come through in this very effectively. Now, the three rival traditions of the third volume are ones which obviously are different in their view of reason, as well as their view of the basis of ethics. Number one is the Aristotelian tradition. The Aristotelian tradition, which, of course, is developed so much more fully by Thomas Aquinas. The second version is the 18th century, 19th century Enlightenment version. He cites a certain 19th century edition of Encyclopedia Britannica, which had an article on ethics, which treated ethics like another science, which was gradually accumulating more and more moral knowledge that was universally becoming recognized until we would have a universal science of ethics, thoroughly grounded in positivistic reasoning. Well, that sort of rationalistic approach, which he sees as the outcome of the rule-governed approach of some of the 18th century writers. Then the third version, the third tradition, is Nietzsche. And this, of course, is the addition that he makes to the others. And I think it's fair to say that he adds the Nietzschean ethic of the strong and the weak-willed in a power struggle, you know, the Nietzsche stuff. Because while he's been working on this other stuff, we've had such a resurgence of postmodernism, you see, with its emphasis now that we call political correctness, but which in essence was subjectivism, talking about my truth and my moral standards and so on and so forth, out of assertion of not rationally grounded, but voluntaristically grounded desires. And so he poses these three alternatives and tries to pose what the decision between them really comes to. But remember that they have different conception of what constitutes rationality. In the case of the first tradition, there is a concept of wisdom, which comes out of Aristotle, wisdom and prudence. Comes out of Aristotle, and again in the Middle Ages. In the second, it's deductive reasoning, in a quasi-scientific fashion, so it's the scientistic ideal. And in the third, of course, reason is simply rationalizing, it is the servant of the emotions. And you can sense in this where he's coming from. Interestingly, this sort of thing ties very much into his own autobiography. Because he started as a young man in the 50s writing on the religious language problem. You remember his contribution to the religious language discussion was in talking of the idiosyncratic platitude, the idiosyncratic nature of religious language as distinct from other languages.